Hey guys, today's lesson is going to be on the modes of the major scale and modal music in general, so let's get into it. So for this lesson I'm going to use the key of C major as my example to generate the chord progressions and the melodies and improvisations in the lesson. So let me just demonstrate the 7 chords that are in that key that I'm going to be using. I'm going to play the extensions of those chords, all the major 7ths, minor 7ths. Just because I think it is going to give us an even richer example of what these modes sound like. So here's the chords in the key on the screen. Now just keep in mind I won't necessarily play those chords in the same position every time I play them. Sometimes I'll play a lower version of one of those chords, but that's all the chords that we're using. And so the next thing we need to talk about are the whole steps and half steps that generate the major scale itself, right? So these are the steps we're going to use to actually construct all these other modes and generate these other iterations of the major scale. And this time we're going to do C because we're using the key of C. But if you do this from any note, you're going to generate a major scale, right? So here's a C major scale on the fretboard, following these particular whole steps and half steps. Okay, so there we have our C major scale. The first mode of a major key is actually the major scale itself, starting on note number 1. But I want you to really think about these whole steps and half steps, okay? So the first mode, if you want to generate the Ionian mode, which is the major scale mode, you want to start on your note of choosing, which is C in this case, and you want to follow those whole steps and half steps. That's going to give you that scale every time. Now, to reflect the sound of that mode, you need something in the background. You need some sort of context, right? Usually a chord progression or even just a bass note. But we're going to use chord progressions in this lesson because I really want to show you particular chord progressions that are common to each modal center and what you'll actually hear out in the real world when you're learning all these tunes, all these modal tunes. So to reflect the sound of the Ionian mode, you need to generate a chord progression that is centered around chord number 1 in the key, right? So usually you want to play a couple of chords in the key to really bring out the sound of the mode. So for the C Ionian mode, I'm going to use the chords C, G, A minor, and F, treating C as the home chord, okay? And the mode I'm going to play on the fretboard is just the C major scale, but keep in mind these steps that I'm talking about. So really the first mode is this particular order of steps. Just forget about C for a minute and just think about the steps, right? So when you start from step number 1 of that pattern of whole steps and half steps, you're going to create the first mode. So that's going to give us the sound of major, which we all know. So let me just create a little loop and demonstrate that for you quickly. So that's the first mode. Now, how do we get these other modal sounds? So what we want to do is to create the other modes, you need to start on the next step of the whole steps and half steps. Now, forget about the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. Let's just talk about the steps for a minute. So if you were to start anywhere on the fretboard and actually start at step number 2, so you're going to go a whole step and then a half step and then a whole step. Now, wherever you start, just keep playing through those steps until you reach that note again. Right, so let's jump back to D, and we're going to play from D that same pattern, starting on a whole step and then a half step, and continuing till we get back to D. That's going to generate a D Dorian scale or D Dorian mode. A mode is basically when you are kind of hijacking the steps of a major scale and you're reorganizing those half steps and whole steps to create a different iteration of that scale. And they each have their own sound when you put them into context, right? So we're going to do that from D, but now let's talk about the chords. What I'm going to do with the chords is I'm going to use the same chords as the key of C, but I'm going to create a chord progression that is based around D minor, the second chord being the home chord of the music. Right, so we're just going to do some simple 2-chord vamps for a lot of these modes. And in this one, I'm going to do D minor 7 and G7. And what we're doing is we're treating D minor like the new home chord of the music, right? So forget about C for a minute. We're actually creating a new center for our music. I'm going to play D minor 7 to G7. And from that D, I'm going to follow the steps of the major scale starting on step number 2 instead of 1. This is instantly going to give us a different sound, right? Not just because we're starting on D, but because of what we're doing with the chords and the whole steps and the half steps. Okay, so you would have heard the whole vibe changes drastically, right? So there we just generated the Dorian mode on the fretboard using the same steps of the major scale, but starting on the second step. In this case, we did D Dorian, and we used the chords in the key of C, but instead of centering around chord number 1 as the home chord, we centered around chord number 2. Now, instead of being stuck in C all the time, you can immediately go and try this in another key, right? The whole formula that we're kind of sticking to is that we're deciding which mode we want to get the sound of. So say you wanted like an E Dorian mode, you can go and try this now on your own if you like. Go and find the key, the major key, in which E is the second chord, right? Write down the steps of the major scale. From E, you're going to play those steps starting on step number 2. That's going to generate an E Dorian scale for you on the fretboard. There's a lot of ways to play it. I'm just playing one position in this lesson. I'm going to play some modes on the top string, some on the second string, depending on which one we're doing. But you can go and try that now. So that would be the key of D major, just to give you that clue. And what you're going to do, you're going to create a chord progression based around the E minor in that key as the home chord. You'll suddenly realize now I can create that vibe of Dorian wherever I want, right? And I can compose music that gives me that sound. So I like to think of modal music as like hijacking or stealing or borrowing the chords of a major key. You're kind of borrowing a major key, you're borrowing the chords, and you're borrowing the steps that generate that scale, and you're creating new scales and new sounds. Let's go through the other modes. I'm going to go through these a little bit quicker because I don't have a ton of time in this video, but I will probably do some more lessons on each individual mode and talk a bit more in depth about each one on its own. So the Phrygian mode is the next mode that we can generate from the major scale and the major key. The Phrygian mode itself is generated when you take the steps of a major scale, but you start on step number 3. And if you do that and you play through until you reach that starting note again, you're going to get a Phrygian scale. Again, you can do this from any note and you'll get a Phrygian scale. We're going to do it from E because we're going to stick in the key of C. Right? So you're going to notice you're going to get a semitone or a half step immediately in the scale, which is like a real strong characteristic of the Phrygian mode. Now, to really reflect the sound of that mode, we need to use the chords in the key that we're in and center the chord progression around chord number 3 as being the home chord. You can play something really simple for this mode, like E minor to F, just the third chord going to the 4th chord in the key. but we're treating E minor as kind of the center of the music. So we're kind of thinking of E minor in the back of our minds as like the one chord, like the home chord. But we are borrowing the chords of C major to do that, right? It's a little confusing at first, but basically once you generate your modal center, you're kind of leaving the original major key behind that you've stolen those chords from. So let's have a listen to how E Phrygian sounds over E minor and F. Okay, so again, we heard the sound change drastically, right? Now we get this kind of dark Middle Eastern sort of vibe. Really beautiful mode, the Phrygian mode. So let's continue with Lydian. Lydian mode is when you use the chords of the major scale, use chord number 4 as the center of the music, as the home chord. And to generate your F Lydian scale, you're going to use the steps of the major scale, start on step number 4, go through those steps until you reach the same note again. So in this case, we're going to do it from F. So we're going to start from the 4th step, right? That's going to give us the F Lydian mode. Okay, so there we have our F Lydian mode on the fretboard, our F Lydian scale, and to really reflect the sound of that mode, we're going to create a chord progression still using the key of C, but we're going to center the music around an F and treat that as the home chord of the music. So I'm just going to play a simple chord progression F to G and treating F as the home chord of the music, right? Let's have a listen to how that sounds. Okay, so there we have the sound of F Lydian. Just keep in mind that there's a lot of positions to play these modes in. You do want to learn each one as its own scale on the fretboard. You can look these up on the internet and you can find the scale shapes for these modes from the top string and from the 2nd string or the 5th string. And you do want to learn them in 2 octaves, and you want to learn every mode eventually as its own scale. So just keep that in mind. But let's continue on to the next mode, Mixolydian. So that's when we take the 5th chord of the key and we base the music around that, and we start on the 5th step of the whole steps and half steps of a major scale, and that's going to generate the Mixolydian scale. We're going to do that from G. I'm going to do that on the top string, on the E string, because I'm going to play this one in 2 octaves, right? I'm going to have a diagram on the screen so you can learn this if you want, starting on my 2nd finger. Okay, now to reflect the sound of that G Mixolydian mode, we're going to use the chords of the key of C, base the music around chord number 5, treat that as the home chord of the music. Now you need to give your ears a little bit of time to adjust to the new root note each time, by the way, just so that you can kind of adjust to the new home chord of each little piece of music that we're playing, right? So let's just play a simple chord progression G to F this time, and I'm going to play G Mixolydian over the top of that. So there we have the sound of G Mixolydian. And you notice there I went pretty bluesy at the end. So some of these modes pair very well with the minor blues or minor pentatonic scale. All right, Dorian is one of those. Mixolydian is another one. And the next one, Aeolian, is another one. I'll probably go further into that when I do an individual lesson on each mode. So let's generate the next mode, Aeolian. When we use the steps of the major scale, start on step number 6. Follow those steps until we get back to the same note again. That's going to give you an Aeolian scale on the fretboard. I'm going to play this one from the top string on the 5th fret. And again, I'll probably play 2 octaves of this one. And our chord progression, we want to base around chord number 6 in the key, which is the A minor. And we're going to play just a simple chord progression, A minor, G, F, right? Treating A minor as the home chord of the music. Play our Aeolian scale starting on the 5th fret of the top string. So there we have the Aeolian scale. This time we have A Aeolian. So again, if you want to try this in another key, go ahead, find a different major key. Start on step number 6 to generate your mode. Focus the music around the 6th chord of that key and you'll get an Aeolian mode in a totally different key. I went pretty bluesy on that improvisation as well because Aeolian is another really bluesy kind of sounding mode. If you listen to classic chord progressions like the solo for Stairway to Heaven, which uses A minor, G, and F. If you listen to the solo on Stairway to Heaven, you will hear Jimmy Page put a couple of notes in there from the A Aeolian mode, as well as just using the A minor blues scale as the main sound for that solo. An important fact about the Aeolian mode is that it is in fact the same scale as the natural minor scale, right? So the natural minor scale is the Aeolian mode. So you would have heard that in a lot of music. Now the last mode is Locrian. Locrian is not my favorite sounding mode. It doesn't have a very strong sound on its own, but you're still going to use the scale of Locrian on the fretboard. For a lot of other things, you will use it to play over a minor 7 flat 5 chord sometimes. You will use it to generate arpeggios. So it's still worth learning. But let's just have a listen to how that would sound. I'm going to use the whole steps and half steps of a major scale, starting on step 7. And that's going to give me a Locrian scale. I'll do that from B, because we want to stick in the key of C. And I'm going to base my chord progression around a B minor 7 flat 5 chord. I'll probably just play a 1 chord vamp for this example. Okay, so there we have the B Locrian mode. As you can hear, it's a pretty unstable kind of sound, but you won't really hear a lot of music that is just purely based around a Locrian mode and just kind of sits on that sound for a while, just because it's a little unstable. It's kind of one of the passing modes I like to think of anyway. Okay guys, thanks for sticking around if you made it to the end. Let me know how you went in the comments. And I really appreciate you guys checking out my page and my lessons. I got some really nice, lovely comments about my diminished lesson and my altered scales in the blues lesson. And I was seriously just blown away and really humbled by such nice comments from people all around the world who thank me for those lessons. So I really appreciate you guys watching, and I'd really love to hear from you what you guys want to learn. I'm back for lessons now, so I'll be uploading as regularly as I can, and I really want to hear from you. What do you guys want to learn? Thanks so much for the support, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Thanks, guys.